vous demandez les questions en français, n'importe quelle langue, anglais, français. Um, Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I think that we are living in times where we very much have to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion in medicine. And I would be remiss if I did not, start this conversation by just recognizing the horrific events that occurred in the last few days in Joliet with the death of Joyce Echaquan. In fact, Madame Echaquan was actually well known to the people at my hospital, at the Montreal Children's Hospital, because she had been there for uh, several months with a premature infant. So in my own hospital, the events are very much in the forefront of our minds. And of course, these events have built upon, the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent focus on Black Lives Matter. And then that occurring in the world of COVID, where we have very much discovered the health inequities that are experienced by structurally marginalized people. What I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about is selecting for medical studies and thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in medical studies. I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare. Ideologically, the way I'm going to be speaking to you comes from a focus on social justice and a kind of an understanding of the structures within society. Uh, Excuse me, I just checking to see if everything's okay. An understanding of the structures in society as, expressing a logic. And if you want to think about what the logic of our medical system might structure in society, I'm going to be provocative and I'm going to say that the medical system is white supremacist. That's the logic of the system. And I think that one of the goals is to really try and work at allowing people to show their best in the selection process as much as possible. So emancipating individual agency. Who am I? My MD is from Toronto in 1990, probably before most of you were born. And I am of Caribbean background, Indo-Caribbean background, and I, grew up in Canada in an immigrant family. From perspective of my training, I'm pediatrics and pediatric critical care medicine at McGill University. I've had several educational leadership positions. Most notably for this conversation, I have been an admissions dean at McGill University from 2009 to 2015. And my sort of area of research is really about critical scholarship, policy, and curriculum in equity, diversity, and inclusion in health professions education. So I'm going to start by telling you about two people who are applying to medical school. The first one is Joe, and the second one is Magali. So Joe has a grade point average of 3.7 on a 4.0 scale. And he has a BSc from Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. And he is someone who has worked in the summers planting trees in British Columbia, and also is quite socially active, organizing a food bank drive in his home neighborhood, which is Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. And then there's Magali. Magali has a grade point average of 3.82. And her background is also in science. She has worked for 2 summers in a research lab at McGill University, where she has been actually successful, just about to get a publication from her work. And her background is that she's a Montreal person as well. She attended Collège Marie de France, and then subsequent to that, Collège Jean de Brébeuf, and then went straight and directly into her bachelor's degree at McGill University. So I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask you to respond in the chat. Who do you think should get into medicine here? And I'm going to see if I can sort of see the chat. I'm having trouble seeing the chat. Let me just see if I can get the chat up. Not getting the chat. I might stop sharing to show the chat. Just one sec. Oh, there it is. There's the chat. So Joe. So everybody, a lot of people are saying Joe. And I'm going to ask some of the people who said Joe as to why. And then there's someone who's written both as well. So both of you are saying, many of you are saying both. And some of you are saying can't decide. Both are great candidates. And I think, so I'm going to go back and share again. So just excuse me while I do that. So both are, so I think the point that I want to bring out about here is that, both of them are actually great candidates, and they're both good in their own ways, right? One is kind of I would say a bit more of a traditional candidate, at least from McGill University, in the sense of the research and the that sort of thing. I did throw in some elements. This is an audience that knows about Montreal and so on. So I presented you with an elite school and an elite cégep, Collège Jean de Brébeuf. And then the other candidate is someone who's shown some community focus, who has worked, but also would bring a lot to medical school. Those of you that wrote both, here's the thing. You can't have that, right? Because actually at McGill University, about 3,000 people apply for 180 positions. So that there actually are choices that have to be made. That is actually the thing that we cannot change. In the conversation, if we prioritize one versus the other, the people who are on one side can always say that if you're prioritizing the other side, that you're engaging in social engineering. And I think that one of the points that I want to bring out is that no matter what we're doing, we're actually engaging in social engineering. We're actually selecting based on social attributes often, in addition to academic outcomes. So, what I want to bring up here is that selection is an active power. We tell people that you cannot join a profession, or you can join a profession through the act of selection. And within that selection are implicit discourses. The idea of meritocracy. What are we seeing as good? What are we seeing as meritorious of being seen? Of being given a 6 versus a 5 on a Likert scale. And I think one of the things that I want you to think about here is that whether we do a 5 or a 6, it depends upon our social interpretations. And that comes from social judgment. And those social judgments come from societal discourses. So that what we're seeing as excellent is being interpreted through a social lens, and it's an act of power over people. How do we address power issues? I think that we need to have a perspective. So here's a perspective. I'm going to say that systems, systemic racism is against indigenous and also against Black people is there. And maybe the perspective is that we should change the way we select to prioritize addressing systemic discrimination. So I think that when we address power, we have to accept that there is always a social imperative that we are, socially engineering either way. And one of the best ways to address power imbalances is to diversify the selector perspective. And to make sure that when you go to your MMIs, that you see many different kinds of people from many different kinds of backgrounds who are bringing their unique perspectives to selection. And I think that we also want to train people who select to be conscious as to where their notions of excellence are coming from, and to really be able to sort of tease apart what they're seeing. So if I look at Magali and I say, I think her research background is amazing and excellent, and she comes from an excellent school, two excellent schools, Marie de France and Collège Jean de Brébeuf. I need to reflect on the class bias in what I might be saying there, and to encourage explicit discussions. You might have thought that this talk was going to be a lot about quantitative conversations. Who's not getting in? What do we know? What don't we know? That's not where the talk is. I want to let you know that to summarize the quantitative literature on selection very quickly for you, in many, many ways, in many, many studies, in multiple contexts, different countries, different selection processes, it has been demonstrated that in terms of desired outcomes, we generally do a good job, that graduation rates exceed 99%, that we are able to correlate performance tools, certain selection tools such as the MMI or the Casper, with subsequent performance in medical school or on Medical Council of Canada exams, that in general, our provincial bodies have low complaint rates for physicians, so we're doing a good job, and that broadly health outcomes are mostly improving. We also have much evidence in many, many different environments that we continue to have significant demographic underrepresentation for persons from structurally marginalized groups, that there are biases in the selection system, that pathway programs have unattained goals, and that we bring students from diverse backgrounds into educational systems where they experienced racism and discriminatory environments. And also that there are patients who are from structurally marginalized groups that do not experience as good outcomes because the profession is not as diverse as it should be. So that summarizes the quantitative literature for you. And I think one of the things that comes up is that many people who want things to not change will talk a lot about this part, that there are a lot of good outcomes already. We have selection systems that are working well. And people who want systems to change will talk a lot about the undesired outcomes of selection. And I think that for the people who don't want things to change, we need to think about what are the problems. And I call this the denominator problem. Okay. So, yes, the students that are getting into medical school generally graduate well, but that's not the denominator of interest. The denominator of interest is actually the students who didn't get into medical school, plus the students who did get into medical school, all of whom would make perfectly fine physicians. And within there, we see the big problem with not, but with having selection systems that do not reflect the equity and diversity of society. And I think as well that there are kind of, when we sort of don't think about the denominator properly, we start to conflate the outcomes of interest. So the outcomes of interest really involve diversifying the profession for very good reasons. So I'm going to give you an example here. So this is a multiple mini interview station. So this is with a standardized actor. And this is the scenario from the candidate's perspective. You are on a plane about to take off. Your your neighbor in the seat beside you starts having a panic attack. So the evaluator, who is behind a one-way mirror, who's watching the candidate interact here, is struggling whether to give a 5 or a 6 on the empathy dimension, which is in the little sheet that that she has to fill out. What might be being evaluated in this MMI? And I'm going to ask you to respond in the chat. I'm going to stop the share for a second. Okay. And I'm going to ask you to respond in the chat so that I can see. So please respond. Active listening, I'm seeing. You can respond in French, by the way, as well. No problem. Any other thoughts? An ability to understand what the person is going through. Comforting words and making the person comfortable. So I think we're seeing already here that the 3 people who responded have different ideas of what they want to understand about empathy. One has active listening. One has something that's a bit hard to observe, which is the understanding of a person, what a person is going through. Another has concentrated on, and I would say, a kind of like an outcome, something that you can easily observe, whether someone uses comforting words or makes the person comfortable. I think you could think about what might be some behaviors that would be watched for that. Another has brought up the ability to use potentially useful advice. So like knowledge, actually, the knowledge that you are, should use some slow breathing techniques and so on. Nonverbal communications, so gestures and so on. Keeping calm and self-control. See, already we're seeing so many different interpretations to that. And I'm just going to try and get down to the right place for this. Hang on. Sorry about this. It's hard for me to see the chat for some reason when I'm in share mode. So the point I want to bring out about here is that ticking off a 5 or a 6 on an empathy dimension can go so many different ways. And I think that what this brings up, and is one of the major ways that inequities proceed through in a selection process, I'm just looking at time, 10:34, is that we sit there and we get a sheet that says, quantify this person's empathy. And we have to sit there and take the quality of empathy and turn it into numbers. And I think that one of the big points that I'd like to bring up in your conversation is that the way we do that is through social constructs. So we have to decide what is the social construct of empathy so that we can quantify it. And when we do that, that is an act of interpretation. and is very much rooted in how we are understanding the social construct of empathy. And the social construct of empathy is affected by culture, by who's observing, by who's being observed. And that is one of the major ways that inequities can proceed. What this implies for selection practice is that prior to quantification, there must always be interpretation. So when I was an admissions dean, I worked very hard to get people to understand that they were interpreting through a lens of something before they were ticking off a number. And it made people uncomfortable because they want the numbers to be true, but that's only true through a social construct. So I think one of the other things that I want to build in is that one of the major ways to address equity in the selection process is to get people thinking about what are the social constructs through which they're seeing excellence, through which they're seeing merit for a selection process. And again, here we need to consciously diversify selector perspectives. Here's another example. This is a CV review. So we at McGill review curricula vitae on candidates, and we have volunteering versus a summertime job. So we have one candidate who worked in a bank in the summer versus one who has volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, building houses in Guatemala. Which is the more valuable volunteering? Which is more valuable, volunteering or work experience? And I'm going to stop the share for a second and hear from the chat. So somebody's written work, somebody's written both. Volunteering depends on the nature of the volunteering. Work and the work depending on the nature. So people are getting a notion here. I'm going to go back to share screen again. And I'm totally sorry about doing this to you guys all the time. But that's just the way my computer seems to be working. Let me get back. Yeah. So I think people, attendees are getting the picture here that it depends. So what is the volunteering for? Why did someone volunteer? Why are they working versus volunteering? And again, it gets at kind of an interpretation that is made as to why this is happening. In medical school, volunteerism is often seen as a kind of a symbolic representation of someone's ability to be altruistic, which is one of the things that we're looking for. But is it really? It depends. So I think here, and this is probably not going to be familiar, going to be unfamiliar to you, is that basically volunteerism has a class bias, right? So you're only able to volunteer in the summer if you don't have to work in the summer to make money. And this has been shown in many, many different studies. So there's nothing wrong with volunteering, and volunteering can actually be a very valuable activity, but not volunteering doesn't mean that you didn't want to volunteer. It might mean that you couldn't volunteer because you have to work. So I think that you have to sort of, again, look at your interpretations, the interpretations that are being made about volunteering or not in a selection process. And I used a fancy word there, which is hermeneutics. It's really the art of interpretation. And I think that, again, we have to build that in the people who are reading CVs so that they're able to look at how they're making these interpretations. And one of the things that helps, and we tried to bring in at McGill, is to really bring in the notion of equity checking interpretations, Why are you seeing this work experience as less valuable as volunteering? And I'll use my own example. I come from a very humble family, and I actually did work in a bank in the summers prior to medical school. And actually, 30 years on, 35 years on, 30 years on, not 35, I can say that as an intensive care physician, some of the some of the things that I learned in the bank, teamwork, working together, having responsibility, and so on, are things that I call upon today as a physician. So that experience was actually quite valuable for me. So just looking at time again. So here's another one. This is a discussion that is happening at a discussion that I had as an admissions dean, where I looked at pathway programs. So these are programs for Indigenous students, for Black students, for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, to try and attract them into medicine. So we have a candidate, a colleague who comes to speak to me and says, "We have a program for them. Why aren't they making it through?" And the colleague is genuinely concerned. So what bothers you about how this issue is being talked about? So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to ask you to explain to me what bothers you. I'm seeing some. I'd like to see what might be. It illustrates the notion of equality, not equity. Okay, that's an interesting one. How that person thinks that every student faces the same difficulties. Okay, so yeah, not one size fits all. Other responses. I'm just going to wait and see if that a lack of understanding of individual background. They're assuming the problem is the student, not the program. That's a beautiful thing to talk about. Actually, we will talk about that in a second. I'll just see if they're that we're using them rather than talking to the communities affected. That's an important one. It doesn't consider the diversity of backgrounds. For example, someone who has to work full time to pay his studies won't be able to have the same quota as someone who has quota his GPA. Yep. Okay. So let me go back to share screen. And let it come out. Trying to get it to share screen. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So I think that this gets at exactly all the things that you were bringing up around considering someone's context, how they show excellence within that context, right? And um, I think it would be about someone who is relatively privileged, recognizing that maybe they couldn't get the same quota if they had to work all summer, for instance. Or, and this is something that I had to learn. I grew up in cities my whole life. Um, and I had to learn about sort of persons from rural backgrounds and the kinds of opportunities that are not available necessarily to students from rural backgrounds, simply because I happen to grow up in proximity to research labs, for instance, that a person from a rural background may not have been able to be exposed to. So this gets at a bit the definition of diversity. And I think that one of the issues with diversity is that we sometimes think about kind of like the ideal, and then the diversity is all of these sort of deviations from the ideal. So the ideal might be a student from an upper middle class background who is from an urban setting, who has the affordances available to them. And then the kind of like diversity are all those other things that I was talking about. That's not the way that I want you to think about diversity. There is no norm. Populations, so the populations of students applying to medical school, for instance, they share something in order to be a population. So they share that they're applying to medical school. So the diversity of that population is simply the things that they do not share, that they come from many different backgrounds, that they have different affordances and constraints. And I think, we see this in medicine, actually. This is a bit of a deviation, but from the talk. But when you learn about that 70-kilo white male, that's the norm, and that that actually can result in real health inequities. What you really should be learning is this is the population that we look after, and this is how they're different. And there's a lot of literature that actually shows inequities resulting from that. So what I call this is casting a white gaze. So in this situation, it was casting a white gaze on pathway programs. And that can result in colonizing approaches, not asking and understanding the community's perspective about the problems that we're seeing. And also looking at the problem as deficiency versus resilience. So that we're doing these things to address deficiencies in this population rather than this population is bringing specific resiliencies to student selection. And I think what this leads me to say is that one of the things you need to do is question your excellence criteria. And one of the ways to question excellence criteria is to actually talk to the communities, the stakeholders that we want, and try and understand how they would see excellence in selection if they were given the chance to. So what about equity? So equity is a poorly defined term, often in Canadian medical schools. But the way I think about it is that we need to recognize historic injustice. But not only that, we need to recognize medical schools, so Université de Montréal, McGill University, Laval University, Sherbrooke University, as central to the propagation of those injustices. So we taught obstetricians and gynecologists who, up until 1971, sterilized Indigenous women. So we have a part in that. And our institutions were integral to that, so that provides us with a rationale with having to address equity in our institutions. So how might the selection conversation change if equity is understood that way? What we might do is we might question our excellence criteria and bring in equity. We might link selection to institutional mandate and history. We might say that there is structural racism within our institutions, and our excellence criteria might need to change to address that. And it provides a theoretical framework for pathway programs and other programs of selection. So, sorry, I did want to bring up one issue here, which is that sometimes those of us from structurally marginalized groups, look at myself as a brown person, I can sort of claim to come from a structurally marginalized group. Sometimes when the conversation talks about another structurally marginalized group, say Indigenous people, we can sort of say, well, why do we have to address that versus my own marginalization? And I'm going to tell you that what we need to do is we need to avoid the oppression Olympics. My oppression is worse than your oppression, or something like that. Both truths can coexist within the same conversation. And what we really need to do is look at history and outcomes in the present. And if we were to look at history and outcomes in the present, we would get a very, very strong case for addressing anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism within our medical schools. Another thing that comes up, I'm just looking at time, excuse me. Yep, we have time. Another thing that comes up, so this is another anecdote. So I continue to be, but I was and have been and continue to be very involved in my own university, McGill University, in efforts to address inequities, such as what I've been talking about just recently. So I had a faculty member, a colleague, come and talk to me and say to me, Salim, I love what you're doing. You're working at addressing inequities. You're working at pathway programs, for instance. Um, uh, but is what you're doing unfair? Is it unfair to the rich kids who live in Outremont and Westmount? I don't mean any disrespect to anybody who comes from Outremont and Westmount, but I'm just using that example because I'm with an audience who might actually understand those references. Is it unfair? Those students work hard too. So I guess what I'm going to ask you is, how would you define fairness? How is fairness defined? So I'd ask you to respond in the chat, respond to all panelists and everyone and all attendees and panelists. Going to stop the share for a second and see what you come up with.
Dr. Razak, would you like
Yeah.
me to, do you want me to read the chat and so you can keep sharing, or are you okay?
I think I'd rather read the chat myself,
Perfect.
actually. Thank
Okay,
you.
sounds good. All right.
All right. So let's see what the chat comes up with. Equal efforts equal outcomes. Giving the same opportunity to achieve a goal. So that's equal opportunity equals fairness. Any other thoughts? Taking into account the background and work of the person. So that's equal effort equal outcomes. Ensuring that entrance to medical school is not gate kept by a particular social group. So that's got a little bit the social aspect to fairness. Same opportunity equals same outcomes. Okay. So this is a very, shall we say, sophisticated audience who has really gotten at all of the issues. So let me go back to sharing my screen. So let me so I actually, because so many of the disagreements around what we do to make things better, and I have been around many disagreements over the years, and I've even been the subject of kind of like many heavy discussions around what is fairness um, in these efforts. Really, and I actually appreciate the colleagues who brought those up to me, because it caused me to look at what is the logic of fairness. And it turns out that fairness has a rich intellectual tradition, a philosophical tradition that has been going on since way before you and I, right back to people like Aristotle and so on, that really divides up into three broad philosophical orientations around fairness. So the first one is equal ability equals equal chance of success. So that is the demonstration of ability. So that would be the kind that would say, let's have just a fair selection process if we can. Let's get rid of the biases in the selection process. Let's put people through, and who makes it through makes it through. Okay? That's one way of looking at fairness. The next one is equal potential equals equal chance of success. So this would be, we know that some people, through the processes that we've set up, aren't able to demonstrate their potential. So let's adapt our selection processes so that they can show equal potential, so that people with equal potential can have equal chance of success. A very simple example of this would be at McGill. We think it's really important that you show us who you are in the best language of either English or French that you can show us, so that we don't have you speaking in your second language when you're selecting for us, so then who makes it through gets in. Then the last one, and some of you brought this up in the talk, is we recognize that we actually want some outcomes. We want equity outcomes. We want patients to be seen. We want patient outcomes that are good, so that some individuals, just by virtue of the social group that they belong to, might be able to demonstrate that better. So we actually know that Indigenous patients um, may suffer less systemic racism if there are more Indigenous physicians. So that we need to think about bringing in Indigenous physicians into medicine. And and that's another way of looking at fairness. And in fact, I reflect on the kinds of arguments that I've had with colleagues and just different people over the years around fairness. And basically, it's come to this point where it's a clash between maybe they see it this way and I see it this way, or I see it this way and they see it this way. And what I would say is that we need to bring in um, some explicit discussion about how are you seeing fairness, or how do we as an institution see fairness. And I would pose it to you that we need to see fairness much, much more about societal outcomes in this day and age, because we are seeing systemic racism. We are seeing Joyce Echaquan being treated the way she was treated. And that is not what we want. I always put this picture of Lieutenant Uhura up, and this is a young audience. You may not know, this is from the first Star Trek in the 60s. I did not see this in real time. I saw this in reruns. I want you to know that I'm not old enough to have seen Lieutenant Uhura in non-reruns. But I want to bring out a fairness outcome here, which is representation. So I think that we should have the inside looking a little bit more like the outside looks. So why is Lieutenant Uhura an example of representation? You know, things like Star Trek can be extremely powerful in what they make people like me dream. So when I saw Lieutenant Uhura as the communications operator on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, I saw a Black woman who was in a position of power, who had competencies. She spoke Klingon, for instance. She was the communications operator. And I guess the way I would say it is I saw the future, and people of color were in it. And I think that representation is a very valid societal outcome. I think this is the last anecdote. I'm just looking at time. Yep. I probably will finish with about 10 minutes for comments and questions. So this is the last anecdote, and then I have a few summary slides. And so this is an Indigenous now physician. She was a resident or a medical student when I spoke to her about this. But she came to me, and I was in a bit of a role of mentorship. And she said to me, you know, everybody's telling me that it's so great that I'm in medicine, and that I'll go back and help my community probably as a family doc. But she said, but I really want to be a specialist. And she was feeling the guilt of that, especially since everybody was sort of talking in terms of her going back to her community. And if she's a specialist, she'll probably be able to help her community. But let's face it, specialists usually need to be in larger hospitals where they are supported and have the patient base. So I was sort of thinking about this, and I was sort of saying, what is about this? What's wrong about this? The sort of well-meaning words that she's getting. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think about that? Should it be assumed that she's going to go back and help her community or not? So I'm going to ask you, I'll stop the share and I'm going to check the chat again. Okay. So let's see what you respond. There's a burden placed on a lot of us medical learners that so there can be a minority burden, right? There can be. I know that the diseases of South Asian people are less studied, right? And maybe I'm going to feel that burden as a member of the inside. Or I know that often Muslim families are improperly understood in my setting. So am I going to be the one that has to sit there and understand them for everyone? It depends on why she chose the medical field. If it's for her own personal interest, then I don't see why she is assumed to do this, putting the pressure of change on a single individual. You're very much identifying the issues. So I'm going to tell you the way I thought it through. I was sort of thinking, just by her presence in the medical profession, she is addressing inequity, right? And she is a free agent. She can choose what she wants to do. So in the end, I told her, I said, you don't have to carry the whole 400 years of colonization on your back. If you want to become a hepatobiliary surgeon, go ahead and do that. You're doing good just by your presence. So I think the philosophical tensions in this case are really about structure versus agency. Okay, and then this may be a term you may be a little bit unfamiliar with, but what you do and what you can do with your power and your abilities is your agency. I can act in the world. I can try to get into a hepatobiliary fellowship, or for her, it would start off with being in a general surgery residency program. And then there are the structures in place. So the systemic racism that my people experience, and the fact that Indigenous programs for medical students are aimed at addressing structural inequities. So, I think that here it's the problem of white gaze again. Looking at that medical student as an agent to address the structural inequities that she didn't construct. In fact, white society constructed them, basically. And I think that you have to sort of accept in a selection process that people are free agents. Maybe you designed the program to actually address structural inequities, but people are free agents. And the outcome of an Indigenous woman becoming a hepatobiliary surgeon is a perfectly great outcome in addressing structural inequities. It may not have been the one you wanted, but it's a perfectly good outcome. So you have to be ethical. We have to be fair to individuals. This is the last one, actually. I do want to do this one. So because this is a real thing that happened. So this is un collégien très fluvien qui s'applique à McGill. Okay, the English University. He's coming in French, though, to be evaluated in French. And he's coming with all the kids from Montreal who are all well dressed for their MMI interviews. Like sort of the women are in high heels and blazers and skirts, smart skirts, and the men are wearing blazers and so on. He has come in sneakers and polo shirt. And one of my colleagues, who is an evaluator, saying, "It's funny. It's like he doesn't respect the process. Everybody else is so well dressed." It's not that it matters to me, but I find it a bit strange that he has come. So what do you think about this particular case? And I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to hear what you have to say. I see Dr. Vallon is here. Thank you, Dr. Vallon. It's been a few years since we've chatted. And I think you may know who the hepatobiliary surgeon is that I am talking about. He might not be able to afford formal clothes. Il n'avait pas probablement la référence de l'important. So he did not get the memo, maybe. He doesn't know what the kids from Montreal know. Yeah, so you're getting many of the points here. Maybe for him, this is formal. So I'm going to go back and share the screen. And not all have earnings to dress formally. Here's an example. There's a medical student that I know quite well who told me that she went to a shop on Laurier Street and got a very expensive $1,000, outfit for her MMIs, and then she returned it the next day. Um, uh, this is something that she did. This is someone from a number of years ago, so nobody's going to be able to be identified from this. But I think what I take from these kinds of stories and the story of the young man with the sneakers is you don't know why people do what they do. You have to check. And if you have an expectation about people that they should come in formal dress, you should make it explicit because maybe that person didn't get the memo. Inclusive selection processes are processes where people know what they're supposed to do, that you give the information. And I think of inclusion like a dinner party. If you come to a dinner party, and I've had this experience of going to friends' houses when I was younger, do you know what fork to use for the right dish that you've got? Do you know that the shrimp fork is supposed to be used for the shrimp dish? I generally did not. So I think one of the things is that if we're going to welcome diverse candidates, we have to give the information for diverse candidates. The last point is this notion of meritocracy, and this is what it builds to. I think that, what we need to do is we need to have inclusive notions of what is meritorious. Where if you're hearing noise in the background, those are my twins. They're just returning from the park, but they're quite far away from me right now. So I think maybe you won't hear them, but I do apologize for that. So, we need to sort of have a conversation of what is inclusive merit. An Indigenous student who has overcome a whole bunch of obstacles that you and I can't even imagine is showing excellence. And we need to have an inclusive definition of excellence in order to appreciate that excellence in our selection processes and really question what these excellence criteria are. So we need to link excellence criteria to societal outcomes and address the hidden curriculum within selection. Sometimes my colleagues long for the old days and they talk about nostalgia for the time when things were simpler. And I'm going to just tell you that nostalgia gets remembered through the narratives of those who were empowered in the past. In the past, when it was mostly white men in medical school, was it really okay for those other people who didn't get in? Was it really all that great? So I think we need to incorporate marginalized narratives into what the past was. In the past, when people were not getting in, who were very good, I think we need to bring those stories into what we're seeing as the past. So I think that we need to move forward. We need to build structures that look at the at how we are seeing excellence. So the theory behind how we see excellence and how those interpretations move to the practice of ticking off a 5 or a 6 on a Likert scale. And I really think that that's how we need to do it. We need to bridge the theory praxis divide. So we need to look at the philosophy of selection. I won't go through this slide. I'm happy to talk about it because I talked about it very much in my previous conversation. You guys brought it all out. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I'm going to stop the share, and I'm ready to take questions that you may have. So I guess I will moderate the questions. I will just go based upon who comes first. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Is that correct, Kenza?
Yes, that should be fine.
Great. So are there any questions or comments? Just put your I would say in the chat, just say I have a question or a comment. Any questions? I have a question that might be a bit off topic. Please go ahead. Chitron, is the, I don't know if that's the last name or the first name. Please go ahead, ask your question.
Well, actually, since this is a webinar format, I don't think they can open their mic, but they can type in the chat.
Okay, so I'll do it this way. So I'll wait for your question. So I see our admissions committees in Quebec composed of diverse groups, not as diverse as we would like them to be, but it's definitely a focus of what we're trying to do. The chat is moving very fast for me, so I don't want to miss people. Yeah, so they're definitely not as diverse as we want them to be. But I'll tell you something, we know that this is a high impact activity. So if you diversify selection committees, no matter what you do, if you don't even change your selection process at all, you're actually likely to improve the diversity of the medical classes, for instance. What is your opinion on positive discrimination? So you're using actually the French term, discrimination positive. In English, it's often called affirmative action. And or quotas based on medical school admissions processes. It's a very, very difficult question. I would say that the way I like to frame it, though, I don't like to frame that there's a quota for tel group ou un autre. I like to say it this way. I like to say that there are these number of positions that are dedicated to the evaluation of excellence in a different way than they are dedicated in other places. So an example of this would be an MD PhD program versus an MD program. You have different ways of selecting excellence in an MD PhD program than you do in an MD program. So that if you are, for instance, designing a program to serve the needs of rural populations, you would want to have different excellence to select for rural populations. You're not having a quota for rural students necessarily. You're having a different way to select. So just one or two more questions. What is your opinion on race-based medicine? I just want to move down a little bit more to get the question. Race-based medicine and the fact that it's taught in medical school. Okay. So this bit off topic, but it's like my favorite topic ever. So I don't mind you learning about differences between people and differences in outcome and differences in responses to treatment. But what I absolutely do mind is if you're taught that that is so for instance, if you're taught that there's different outcomes in lung, I'm seeing here lung capacity based upon an ethnicity or race, if you're taught that that is essential to the person, to the ethnic person, rather than a social determinant of health, I think that that is incorrect, because race is a social construct, and it is through, for instance, when we're taught about differences in blood pressure, say with Black people versus white people, it's not that there are different genetics. It's actually that there's different experience of racialization and discrimination experienced by Black people. So it's actually the social determination that causes the hypertension difference. That is what you should be taught. And I also think that we have a long way to go to decolonize and to take the systemic racism out of the curricula that you are taught. I think I will take. I actually think it's 11:15, so I'm not able to respond to the rest of your questions. I don't know, Kenza, if you have any final words that need to be said before we move on.
No, we're good. So I would just like to thank you, Dr. Razak, for joining us today and for the talk. I mean, the organizing committee and all the attendees really thank you for it. It was definitely not only interesting, but like very important and eye-opening for many of us too. So yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll let Maria go ahead and present the next speaker.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have like 4 minutes of break, and at 11:20 we're gonna start with Dr. Shaheen Hussain, who I'm gonna put as a panelist at this meeting.